The morning of November 9th, 1942. Somewhere over the Greenland ice cap, First Lieutenant Armand Monteverde gripped the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress and stared into nothing. The world outside his cockpit had become a seamless wall of white. No horizon, no sky, no ground, just an infinite expanse of colorless void that pilots called flying in milk. Beside him, co-pilot Second Lieutenant Harry Spencer checked the instruments for the third time in as many minutes. The altimeter read 3,000 feet, but that meant nothing when you couldn't see what lay 3,000 feet below you. "Spence," Monteverde said quietly, "I'm going to try to turn us around." The B-17 PN-9E had taken off from WWII West 1, the American air base at Narsarsuaq on Greenland's southwest coast, just 2 hours earlier. Their mission was simple: find a C-53 cargo plane that had crashed on the ice cap 4 days before, locate the 5 survivors, radio their position to rescue teams, then return to base. Now Monteverde couldn't even find his own position. He began a gentle left turn, trying to reverse course back toward the coast. The whiteout conditions made it impossible to maintain visual references. He was flying blind, trusting instruments that told him he was level when his inner ear insisted he was banking. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The left wing struck first. There was no warning. One moment the B-17 was flying. The next moment metal was screaming against ice and the entire aircraft was spinning sideways down a glacier. The impact tore the bomber in half. The forward section separated completely from the tail. The aircraft skidded nearly a quarter mile across the frozen surface before finally grinding to a halt. Then silence. Monteverde opened his eyes. He was alive. Around him, men were groaning, moving, calling out to each other in the darkness. "Sound off," Monteverde ordered. One by one, the voices came back. Navigator Second Lieutenant William O'Hara. Engineer Technical Sergeant Alfred Best. Radio Operator Corporal Loren Howarth. Gunner Staff Sergeant Lloyd Puryear. Private First Class Alexander Tuxieron. Private Clarence Waddell. Spencer was there too, dazed but conscious. 9 men had been aboard. 9 men had survived, but 2 were badly hurt. Private Paul Spina's left arm was broken, his feet already turning black from the cold. Staff Sergeant Puryear had suffered back injuries and could barely move. Outside, the temperature was 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. They had no cold weather gear, no tents, no sleeping bags, no proper winter boots. They had K rations for maybe a week. They had parachutes they could use as blankets and seat cushions for insulation. They were stranded on a glacier in the middle of the Greenland ice cap in November, the beginning of the Arctic winter, and no one knew exactly where they were. That first night, crowded together in the tail section of the bomber, Monteverde gathered his men and spoke words that would become legendary among the survivors. "This is as new to me as it is to you," he told them. "According to regulations, I am in charge, but I want any and all suggestions. We will work it out together." What none of them knew was that they would spend the next 5 months on that glacier. That rescue attempts would fail again and again. That other men would die trying to save them. And that their story would become one of the most extraordinary survival ordeals in the history of World War II. To understand how 9 American airmen ended up stranded on the Greenland ice cap, you must first understand the lifeline that connected North America to the war in Europe. The route was called Operation Bolero, the pipeline through which American air power flowed to Britain. Every bomber, every fighter, every transport aircraft destined for the European theater had to cross the Atlantic. The distance was too great for direct flight. Instead, they hopscotched across the North Atlantic through a chain of bases that pilots called the Snowball Route. From Presque Isle, Maine to Goose Bay, Labrador. From Goose Bay to WWII West 1 in Greenland. From Greenland to Keflavik in Iceland. From Iceland to Scotland. Greenland presented unique dangers. 80% of its surface is covered by an ice sheet up to 2 miles thick. The ice cap creates its own weather systems. Storms materialize out of nowhere. Visibility drops from clear to 0 in minutes. On November 5th, A C-53 Skytrooper cargo plane with 5 men aboard had taken off from Iceland bound for WWII West 1. The aircraft never arrived. Its crew managed to send a weak radio signal indicating they had crash-landed somewhere on the southeastern ice cap, but the exact location was unknown. B-17PN-9E was one of the search aircraft. Lieutenant Monteverde was 26 years old, a native of Oakland, California. He was not a combat pilot but an Air Transport Command ferry pilot with hundreds of hours in B-17s. What the forecasters didn't predict was the sudden whiteout that would engulf the area where Monteverde was flying. The crash that followed was not pilot error in the conventional sense. The whiteout had created an optical illusion that made the sloping glacier appear level. When Monteverde tried to turn, he was already much lower than his instruments indicated. The left wing clipped the ice and physics took over. The fact that all 9 men survived was itself a minor miracle. The B-17's structural strength, built to withstand combat damage, had saved their lives during the crash. But now they faced a battle far more difficult than any they might have fought in the skies over Europe. On November 12th, 3 days after the crash, navigator William O'Hara and co-pilot Harry Spencer ventured outside to scout the surrounding area. It was the first clear day since the crash, and they hoped to determine their location. They walked carefully away from the tail section, testing each step. Crevasses invisible from above could open under your feet without warning. Harry Spencer learned this the hard way. He was perhaps 50 yards from the aircraft when the ice gave way beneath him. 1 second he was standing. The next second he was dropping through empty space. Then he stopped. Wedged in the narrowing walls of the crevasse, about 15 feet below the surface, was a block of ice. It had frozen at just the right angle to catch Spencer's fall. He had dropped onto it hard enough to knock the wind out of him, but he was alive. If he had fallen 6 inches to either side, he would have missed the ice block completely and dropped into the bottomless darkness below. It took nearly an hour to extract him using ropes and a makeshift harness. When he finally emerged back onto the surface, he was shaking. Not from the cold, but from the realization of how close he had come to dying. The near-death experience established a rule the crew followed religiously. No one went anywhere alone, and every step was made carefully, testing the snow ahead with a pole to probe for hidden crevasses. Inside the tail section, the survivors organized their existence with methodical precision. They created routines. Routines gave structure. Structure gave purpose. Purpose kept despair at bay. They divided the day into watches. 2 men always awake, keeping a small stove burning, melting snow for drinking water, watching for search aircraft. The stove was improvised from aircraft pieces, burning small amounts of aviation gasoline carefully controlled to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. Food was strictly rationed. The K-rations meant to sustain 9 men for a week were stretched much longer by cutting daily allowances. Each man received a small portion of crackers, canned meat, and chocolate. It was never enough to satisfy hunger, but enough to keep them alive. Warmth was an obsession. They huddled together for body heat. 9 men packed into a space barely large enough for half that number. They wrapped themselves in parachute silk. They stuffed newspapers and cotton wadding into their clothing for insulation. The cold was relentless. 40 below zero at night, sometimes 50 below with wind chill. Exposed flesh would develop frostbite within seconds. And through it all, they waited. On November 16th, 7 days after the crash, Corporal Loren Howarth achieved something remarkable. Working with frozen fingers and damaged equipment, he managed to repair the B-17's radio transmitter. The radio had been soaked in aviation fuel, its components corroded and damaged. But Howarth understood these systems intimately. When the transmitter finally powered up, Howarth tapped out Morse code, PN9E to any station. We are down on ice cap. Require assistance. 9 souls aboard, 2 injured. He sent the message again and again, listening between transmissions for any response. Nothing. The radio's receiver was still damaged. They could transmit but couldn't hear incoming signals. But someone could hear them. On November 17th, the radio operator at Beachhead Station, a small weather outpost on Greenland's east coast, picked up a faint signal. It was weak, barely readable, but it was definitely Morse code and definitely from PN9E. And on November 24th, 15 days after the crash, Colonel Bernt Balchen spotted them from the air. Balchen was a legend, a Norwegian-born pilot who had made the first flight over the South Pole with Admiral Richard Byrd in 1929. He understood Arctic flying better than almost any man alive. He was now commanding WWII West 8 and coordinating the search operations. Flying a C-54 transport, Balchen circled low over the wrecked bomber, dropping supplies by parachute. Food, medical equipment, warm clothing, fuel. The packages fell from the sky like manna. Balchen also dropped a note telling the survivors that rescue operations were being organized, that motor sleds were being sent overland, that they should maintain their position and keep transmitting. Help was coming, but help would be agonizingly slow in arriving. The motor sled expedition that set out on November 25th encountered immediate problems. The sleds broke down repeatedly on the brutal terrain. Mechanical failures in sub-zero temperatures were common. Progress was measured in miles per day, sometimes less. Meanwhile, another tragedy was unfolding. On November 28th, the Coast Guard cutter Northland received word that an Army rescuer on motorsleds had fallen into a crevasse near PN9E. Lieutenant John Pritchard, the Northland's pilot, flew the ship's Grumman J-2F Duck amphibious plane to the crash site. Pritchard had already made history 2 days earlier by successfully landing the Duck on the ice cap to rescue 2 injured PN9E crew members, then taking off again, the first time anyone had accomplished such a feat on Greenland's glaciers. Now he was returning for a second rescue attempt. Pritchard landed the Duck about a mile from PN9E and walked to the bomber with his radioman, Benjamin Bottoms. The injured rescuer in the crevasse was beyond help. But there were still survivors at PN9E who needed evacuation. Pritchard returned to his aircraft with radioman Loren Howarth from the PN9E crew, planning to fly him back to the Northland, then return for more survivors. But as the Duck took off and headed toward the coast, a storm moved in. Fog rolled across the ice cap with frightening speed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 0. Pritchard radioed the Northland that he was caught in weather and trying to navigate back to the ship. Then the transmissions stopped. The Duck disappeared. Search aircraft found nothing when the weather cleared. No wreckage, no signal, no sign of Pritchard, Bottoms, or Howarth. The 3 men had vanished into the Arctic, never to be seen again. This loss devastated the survivors still waiting at PN9E. The survivors now numbered 8. And the bitter truth was becoming clear. Rescue was not going to be quick or easy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. November gave way to December. December gave way to January. The Arctic winter deepened. Temperatures dropped further. Storms raged for days at a time, burying the wrecked bomber under drifting snow. The motor sled expedition was forced to turn back after one of the rescuers suffered severe frostbite. The men at PN9E were on their own. They survived through iron discipline and the leadership of Armand Monteverde. He maintained morale through example. He enforced the rationing schedule even when men begged for more food. He organized work details to dig out the tail section when snow threatened to bury them. He settled disputes before they could fester. And he gave his men hope. Every day he told them rescue was coming. Every day he insisted they would make it home. Some days maintaining that hope was harder than others. Sergeant Alfred Best fell into periods of deep depression. He would sit silently for hours, staring at nothing. The other men worried he might harm himself. They watched him carefully, never leaving him alone. Private Paul Spina's broken arm never healed properly. It broke again during one of the storms when debris shifted and struck him. His feet, blackened by frostbite, caused constant pain. Navigator William O'Hara's feet were also showing signs of severe frostbite. The tissue was turning black. He could barely walk. They were all suffering from malnutrition. The rationed K-rations provided calories, but not nearly enough. Their bodies were consuming themselves, muscle tissue breaking down to provide energy that food no longer supplied. They lost weight. Their faces became gaunt. Their eyes sank into their skulls. But they did not die. Through December and January and into February, B-17 pilot Kenneth Turner kept the PN-9E crew alive through one of the most remarkable sustained airlift operations of the war. Turner, known as Pappy, was 40 years old, ancient by military aviation standards. He had been an airline pilot before the war. Now he was flying B-17 bombers over one of the most hostile environments on Earth, dropping supplies to men whose lives depended entirely on his skill. The airdrops were acts of precision flying. Turner had to fly low over the wrecked bomber, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the ice, to ensure the supply packages landed close enough for the survivors to retrieve them. But flying that low over a glacier meant navigating around ice ridges in turbulent air, with no margin for error. The packages contained food, medicine, fuel, clothing, and occasionally luxuries like cigarettes and candy that did more for morale than any medicine. Each drop was carefully packed and labeled. But there were days when Turner couldn't fly. Days when storms raged so fiercely that the men at PN-9E couldn't even leave the tail section to retrieve supplies sitting just yards away. During those storms, the survivors huddled together in the darkness and waited. The stove would be extinguished to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The temperature inside would drop to match the temperature outside. Frost would form on the interior walls. And they would talk. They talked about home, about families, about what they would do when they got back to the States. These conversations were survival tools. They kept minds occupied. They reminded men of what they were living for. Spencer talked about Texas, the heat of summer, the smell of mesquite trees, the taste of his mother's cooking. Monteverde talked about California, about Oakland and San Francisco, about baseball games and long drives up the coast with the ocean sparkling beside the highway. These memories became more real than the ice around them. They were proof that another world existed beyond this frozen hell, and that they would return to it if they could just hold on. By February, they had been on the ice for 3 months. The psychological toll was immense. Some men developed nightmares, anxiety, sudden fits of anger or tears. The confined space, the endless waiting, the constant cold, the perpetual hunger. All of it ground away at their mental resilience. There were moments when the darkness seemed overwhelming. Technical Sergeant Best confided to Monteverde that he was thinking about ending his suffering, about walking out onto the ice and simply not coming back. Monteverde talked him back from the edge. He reminded Best that rescue was coming. He pointed to the supply drops as proof that people were trying to reach them. Private Spina had a similar moment of despair. He felt like he was becoming a burden to the others and suggested that maybe they should leave him behind when rescue arrived. The other men wouldn't hear of it. They told Spina they were all getting out together or none of them were getting out at all. This was not empty sentiment. It was genuine commitment. The bonds formed by shared suffering went deeper than anything they had experienced before. They were brothers now, not by blood but by survival. Meanwhile, the military attempted increasingly desperate rescue plans. A second motor sled expedition was launched in January but was eventually forced to turn back. A third expedition using dog sleds was organized in February. This team, led by Captain Harold Strong, made it to within 6 miles of PN-9E before being pinned down by a massive storm. When the weather cleared, Strong and his men pushed forward and reached the wrecked bomber on February 9th. Exactly 3 months after the crash. The reunion was emotional. The survivors had been alone for so long that seeing rescuers overwhelmed their defenses. Men who had maintained stoic composure for months broke down and wept. But the rescue team brought sobering news. The route they had used was too difficult for motorized evacuation. The survivors would have to be moved by dog sled to an intermediate camp, then wait for aircraft evacuation. 6 of the survivors were moved to the motor sled camp. They traveled by dog sled, bundled in sleeping bags and strapped like cargo because they were too weak to walk. 3 men remained at PN-9E. Monteverde refused to leave until all his crew were evacuated. Best and Spina were too badly injured to move safely by dog sled. The wait continued. In March, Colonel Bernd Balchin proposed a plan that was either brilliant or insane. He would land a PBY Catalina flying boat directly on the ice cap. The Catalina was a large twin-engine seaplane designed to land on water, not glaciers. But Balchin reasoned that if he belly-landed the aircraft on its hull, the smooth metal surface might slide across the ice like a sled. It had never been tried before. No one knew if it would work. The first Catalina landing occurred on March 5. Navy Lieutenant Bernard Dunlop piloted the aircraft with Balchin aboard as advisor. They approached the motor sled camp and set the big flying boat down on its hull. The landing was violent. The aircraft slammed into the ice and skidded nearly half a mile before grinding to a halt. But it worked. They had landed. They loaded the 6 survivors aboard and attempted takeoff. The Catalina's engines roared at full power. The aircraft began to move, accelerating across the ice. Faster and faster until finally, impossibly, the hull lifted free and the flying boat was airborne. 6 men were saved, but 3 still remained. Monteverde, Best, and Spina waited at PN9E for the Catalina to return. Days passed, then weeks. The weather turned bad again. Storms made flight operations impossible. On April 5, the Catalina returned. Lieutenant Dunlop made his 3rd belly landing on the glacier, this time directly at the PN9E crash site. Captain Strong's dog sled team helped load the 3 survivors aboard. But the aircraft was loaded with more weight than previous flights. The 3 survivors, the 3-man dog sled rescue team, the Catalina's crew, plus 9 dogs and a sled. Dunlop attempted takeoff. The engines strained. The aircraft began to move. But the weight was too much. They couldn't generate enough speed to become airborne. They tried again. Same result. Balchin made a decision. The dog sled rescue team would have to get off. They would walk to the coast, roughly 25 miles through dangerous terrain, while the Catalina attempted another takeoff with reduced weight. Captain Strong and his teammates unloaded with their dogs. They waved as the Catalina taxied away. This time, with less weight, the engines pulled the aircraft into the sky. The 3 survivors from PN9E were finally free. Monteverde, Best, and Spina arrived at WWII West 1 on April 6, 1943. They had spent 148 days on the ice cap, nearly 5 months. When they stepped off the Catalina, they could barely walk. But they were alive. All 8 surviving crew members eventually recovered, though some carried permanent scars. O'Hara lost toes to frostbite. Spina's arm never fully healed. Spencer developed a lifelong sensitivity to cold. But they had survived. The rescue of the PN9E crew became front-page news in the United States in May of 1943. On May 3rd, Monteverde, Spencer, and radio operator Don Tetley, who had been part of the motor sled rescue team, met with President Franklin Roosevelt at the White House. A 12-part newspaper series told their story to millions of readers. The radio program Cavalcade of America produced a dramatization called 9 Men Against the Arctic. For a brief moment, the PN9E crew was famous. Then the war moved on, and the Arctic ordeal faded from public consciousness. But it never faded for the men who lived it. Harry Spencer developed an obsessive need for certain supplies after the war. His daughter recalled that he bought toilet paper in bulk long before warehouse stores existed. When she asked why, Spencer explained, "I have been without toilet paper, and I am never going to be without toilet paper again." It was a small detail, but it revealed the lasting psychological impact. The deprivation, the awareness that basic necessities could not be taken for granted. Several men reported increased sensitivity to cold for the rest of their lives. Some had nightmares for years afterward. Dreams of falling into crevasses. Dreams of being buried in snow. But they also carried something else. They had discovered reservoirs of strength they never knew they possessed. Monteverde continued his military career, serving through the Korean War and eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He received the Legion of Merit for his actions during the 5 months on the ice. The citation credited him with high devotion to duty and complete disregard for his own safety. The other survivors also received Legion of Merit medals. Kenneth Turner received a Distinguished Flying Cross for keeping them supplied through endless airdrops. Bernd Balchin received a Distinguished Flying Cross for organizing the rescue operation. His willingness to attempt the impossible, Landing a Catalina on a glacier when no one knew if it would work had saved lives. But not all the heroes survived. Lieutenant John Pritchard, radioman Benjamin Bottoms, and Loren Howarth were never found. The wreckage of their Duck aircraft was spotted from the air 4 months after they disappeared, but the bodies were not recovered. They had given their lives attempting to rescue men from PN-9E, and the ice cap had claimed them. The cost of the PN-9E rescue operation was enormous. Multiple aircraft were damaged or destroyed. Motor sleds broke down and were abandoned. Thousands of man-hours were devoted to rescue attempts. But the military never considered abandoning the effort. This was a fundamental principle of American military culture. You did not leave men behind. You exhausted every possibility of rescue before you gave up. The PN-9E rescue embodied this philosophy. No one calculated whether saving 8 men justified the risk to dozens of rescuers. The calculation was simpler. Men were alive, therefore rescue would be attempted. This attitude created a bond of trust between American service members and their command structure. You knew that if you went down, someone would come for you. This knowledge affected combat performance. Men took risks they might not otherwise take because they believed rescue was possible. The Germans noticed this. They commented on it in intelligence reports. American soldiers fought with a confidence that came partly from superior equipment, but also from the knowledge that their military would move heaven and earth to bring them home. The PN-9E rescue demonstrated this principle at its extreme. The survivors had crashed while searching for another downed crew. Pritchard died trying to evacuate them. Multiple rescue teams risked their lives reaching them. But the result was that American servicemen across the entire theater knew the story. They knew that if they went down, rescue would be attempted. That knowledge mattered. The story of B-17 PN-9E eventually faded into the background of World War II history. The invasion of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the final push into Germany. These were the stories that dominated the history books. But the story was not trivial to the men who lived it. Not trivial to the families who waited months without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Not trivial to the rescuers who risked everything. The survivors did not perform superhuman feats. They had no special training for Arctic survival. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. What they did have was leadership, discipline, and refusal to surrender to despair. Monteverde's leadership was quiet but absolute. He led by example, enforcing rules on himself as strictly as he enforced them on others. When food was rationed, he ate the same portions as everyone else. The discipline came from military training but was sustained through conscious choice. Every day, the men could have abandoned the routines that kept them alive. They chose not to, and the refusal to surrender came from fundamental human stubbornness that insists on survival even when survival seems impossible. They also had luck. Enormous luck. They were lucky the crash didn't kill them. Lucky the radio could be repaired. Lucky Balchin spotted them. Lucky Turner kept flying airdrops. Lucky the Catalina landings worked. Survival often requires both skill and luck. The PN-9E crew had enough of both. In the decades after the war, most survivors rarely spoke about their experience. They returned to normal lives. They raised families. They worked ordinary jobs. But the experience never left them. Armand Monteverde died in March of 1988 at the age of 72. He was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. His grave marker lists his rank and service dates. It does not mention the 5 months he spent keeping 8 men alive on a glacier. But those who knew his story understood that those 5 months defined his life. They were the months when he discovered what he was capable of. When he learned that leadership was about serving. When he proved that ordinary men could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Harry Spencer died in the 1980s. The other survivors followed over the years. By the early 21st century, all of them were gone. But the story survived. It survived in official military records, in newspaper archives, in the memories passed down through families, in books like Mitchell Zukof's Frozen in Time, which documented the events for new generations. The story survived because it mattered. It mattered as an example of human endurance. It mattered as a demonstration of effective leadership under impossible conditions. It mattered as proof that rescue operations, no matter how difficult, were worth attempting. And it mattered because it honored the memory of those who didn't make it home. In 2012, nearly 70 years after the events, an expedition traveled to Greenland to search for the wreckage of Pritchard's Duck aircraft. They found it buried under more than 100 feet of ice. But they could not recover it. The ice was too deep, the location too remote. The Duck and the men entombed within it would remain on the glacier. The searchers left a memorial marker and departed. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Some losses are permanent. But the search itself was important. It was an acknowledgement that these men had not been forgotten, that their sacrifice still mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.